A fist pounded on the old farmhouse door, hard enough to rattle the glass. Then it pounded again. A dog barked once from inside, low and rough. On the porch, a woman in a white blazer folded her arms and shouted at the wood, "Get him out! Get him out right now!" A patrol car eased up to the curb. A young deputy stepped out, expecting a noise complaint, something small and routine. He climbed the steps and knocked. The door creaked open, and an old man looked up from a worn armchair. His name was Silas Renner, 78 years old, and he had done nothing wrong. But when the deputy stepped inside and saw what was hanging on that wall, he went pale and stopped breathing. What could an old man do that made a trained young officer freeze in an open doorway? Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a few weeks before any of this started. Silas Renner lived on Birch Lane in Cedar Falls, Iowa. His house was the oldest thing on the street by 50 years. White clapboard, a little gray now where the paint had given up. A porch that sagged in the middle like an old man's shoulders. He'd built the porch himself, back when his hands still did what he asked them to. He'd raised a family in that house, buried a wife from it too. And every single day, rain or shine, he sat out front in the same chair, watching the street he'd lived on since before most of his neighbors were born. Beside him always was Copper. Copper was a shepherd, gray around the muzzle, slow in the hips, and he never left Silas's side. Not for a meal, not for a stranger. When Silas walked to the mailbox, Copper walked with him. When Silas dozed off in the afternoon sun, Copper laid his head across the old man's boots and kept one eye open. Silas had found him half-starved by the Highway 6 winters back, ribs showing, one ear torn, and he'd carried the dog home in his coat and never once talked about giving him up. They were two old soldiers who'd found each other late, and neither one had much use for anybody else. Now here's the thing about Birch Lane. It didn't used to look the way it looks now. 10 years back, it was all little houses like Silas's, modest places with vegetable gardens and chain-link fences, men who worked with their hands and waved when you drove by. But the land got valuable. The old neighbors sold or passed on, and the developers moved in. One by one, the little houses came down and up went the big ones. Glass and stone, 3-car garages, lawns so green they looked painted. New money, new faces, and every one of those new faces, sooner or later, looked down the street at the sagging white farmhouse with the peeling paint and thought the same thing. That old place is bringing us all down. Silas didn't care. He'd stopped caring what people thought of him a long time ago. He kept to himself, tipped his cap to the ones who tipped theirs, and mostly just sat with his dog and watched the world go by faster than he'd ever wanted it to. Then Diane Whitcomb moved in next door. Diane was maybe 50. Sharp clothes, sharper voice. She'd bought the biggest house on the block, and within a month she was on the homeowners association board. Within 2 months she was running it. She had opinions about mailbox height and lawn length and what color a front door was allowed to be. And from the first week she had opinions about Silas. You have to understand, to Diane, Birch Lane wasn't a neighborhood. It was an investment, a number on a spreadsheet that was supposed to go up. And there was Silas, right next door with his flaking paint and his crooked porch and his old dog dragging her number down. She started small. A note in his mailbox about the condition of the property. Silas read it, folded it in half, and used it to prop up a wobbly table leg. Then came a letter from the HOA on fancy paper listing violations: paint, fence, a tree limb hanging over the sidewalk. Silas didn't answer that one either. Then a second letter, then a third, each one a little colder than the last, each one warning about fines he had no way to pay. The truth was, Silas couldn't fix any of it. Not because he didn't want to. His hands shook now. His savings were thin. The little pension he lived on covered food and Copper's medicine and the property tax, and after that there wasn't much left. He'd priced the paint once, standing in the hardware store with a list in his shirt pocket, and he'd done the math twice and put the list back and walked home. He wasn't lazy. He was old and he was alone and he was doing the best a man in his position could do. But Seela didn't see an old man doing his best. She saw a problem. And then one afternoon it got personal. Copper wandered a few feet onto her lawn the way old dogs do and lifted his leg on the corner of her fancy mailbox post. Diane came flying out of her house like the roof was on fire. She screamed at that dog. She screamed at Seela's. She called Copper a filthy stray and said if she ever saw him on her property again, she'd call animal control and have him taken away for good. Seela stood up slow from his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her steady, the way a man looks at something he's already made up his mind about, and he said, "You leave my dog alone." Then he called Copper up onto the porch, and the two of them went inside, and that was that. But it wasn't that. Not for Diane. Because a woman like Diane doesn't forget being told no. She goes home and she stews and she starts looking for a way to win. And she found one. She'd convinced herself somewhere along the line that Seela's didn't even really own the house. An old man like that, no money, no upkeep, no family coming around. No car in the drive, no company on the holidays. She decided he had to be a squatter. Some drifter camping out in a place that should have been torn down years ago. It wasn't true. He held the deed free and clear. But Diane didn't want the truth. She wanted the house gone, the old man gone, the dog gone, and the lot sold to somebody who'd build something worth looking at. So one morning she picked up her phone. She stood at her kitchen window, staring across at that sagging porch, and she dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser," she said, calm as anything. "There's a man squatting in an abandoned house on Birch Lane. He's been here for weeks. There's a stray dog too, it's aggressive, and I have children in this neighborhood. I want him removed. Today." The dispatcher asked a few questions. Diane answered every one of them with just enough of a lie folded into the truth to make it sound real. Abandoned property. No known owner. A vulnerable situation. She even put a little tremble in her voice at the end, the way you do when you want a stranger to believe you're afraid. And then she hung up, poured herself a coffee, and waited by the window to watch the show. Now across the street, Seela's had no idea any of this was happening. He was in his chair with a cup of tea going cold on the armrest and Copper's head resting on his knee. He'd had a bad night. His chest had been tight, his breathing short, and he'd sat up until nearly dawn just to keep the air moving. Now he was just glad to be sitting in the morning light with his dog and a little peace. That peace didn't last long. The patrol car came around the corner slow and pulled up to the curb right in front of his house. Diane saw it and set her coffee down and pressed closer to her window. Here we go, she thought. Finally. The deputy who stepped out was young. 26, maybe 27. Clean uniform, careful eyes. He'd only been on the job a couple of years, and he still took every call seriously, still knocked on doors like the person behind them was a person and not a nuisance. His name was Ray Callahan. He looked at the paper on his clipboard. Trespasser, possible squatter, aggressive dog. He looked up at the old white farmhouse, at the sagging porch and the old man sitting on it, and something about it didn't add up. Squatters didn't usually water the flower boxes. Squatters didn't have a dog that looked at you like it had been guarding that porch for 100 years. And squatters didn't sit out in the open in a chair worn to the shape of them, like a man who'd earned that spot over half a lifetime. Diane couldn't wait. She came marching across her lawn in her white blazer, pointing. That's him. That's the one, get him out. Get him out of there right now, that house isn't even his. Ray raised a hand, calm. Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me handle this. Handle it? He's a squatter. That dog is dangerous. I pay my taxes and I have a right to feel safe in my own neighborhood, and I am telling you. Ma'am, Ray's voice was quiet, but it stopped her cold. "Please, wait by your house." She didn't like that, not one bit, but she took a step back and Ray turned toward the porch. He climbed the steps slow, hands loose and visible, the way you approach someone you don't want to frighten. Copper lifted his head and let out one low warning sound, but Silas laid a hand on the dog's neck and murmured something, and Copper went quiet. "Morning, sir," Ray said. "Sorry to bother you. We got a call. I just need to ask you a couple questions, that's all." Silas looked up at him. His eyes were pale blue and tired, but they were steady. "Ask away, son." "This your house, sir?" 49 years, Silas said. "Built that porch you're standing on. Deeds inside if you want to see it." Ray glanced back at Diane, then at the old man, and the whole thing was already falling apart in his mind. This wasn't a squatter. This was somebody's grandfather. "I'd appreciate that, sir, just to clear it up. Mind if I step in?" "Come on in," Silas said. "Mind the loose board there. Been meaning to fix it 40 years now." And Ray Callahan stepped through the door, still thinking this was the easiest call of his week. A simple misunderstanding. A cranky neighbor. He'd look at the deed, thank the old man, tell Diane there was nothing here, and be back in his car in 10 minutes. He had no idea he was about to walk into the last thing he ever expected to find. Inside, the house was dim and cool and quiet. A ceiling fan turned slow overhead. Silas leaned on the arm of his chair and started to push himself up to go find the paperwork, and Copper padded along beside him, and for 1 second everything was calm. Just an old man, his dog, and a young deputy in a quiet room. The kind of quiet you think is going to hold. Then Ray turned his head and he saw the wall. He hadn't noticed it walking in. But now, standing in the middle of that small living room, he was looking straight at it, and everything inside him went still. On the wall, in a triangle case of dark wood and glass, sat a folded American flag. Beside it hung a faded green uniform patch, the threads worn soft with age. And below that, mounted in a simple black frame, were medals. Ray knew those medals. Any man who wore a badge and had an ounce of history in him knew those medals. A Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and in the center, catching the light, a small 5-pointed star hanging from a pale blue ribbon. The Medal of Honor. Ray Callahan stopped breathing, because right underneath that ribbon was a name, engraved on a little brass plate. And it wasn't a stranger's name. It was a name Ray had heard his whole life. A name his father had spoken with his hat in his hands. A name Ray had grown up thinking belonged to a ghost. Silas Renner. Ray's clipboard slipped in his fingers. His mouth went dry. He turned slowly and looked at the old man shuffling toward the desk, at the gray dog at his heel, at the sagging shoulders and the trembling hands, and for the first time he really saw him. Not a complaint. Not a squatter. Not an old man on a spreadsheet. "Sir," Ray said, and his voice cracked. "Sir, are you Silas Renner, the Silas Renner?" Silas stopped. He turned around, deed in hand, and looked at the young man standing frozen in his living room. "That's the name on the mailbox," he said quietly. "Something wrong, son." And out on the lawn, Diane Whitcomb had no idea. She was still standing there in her white blazer, arms crossed, tapping her foot, checking her watch, wondering what was taking so long. She'd already texted 2 people on the HOA board. She was already picturing the empty lot, the new build, the sold sign. She thought she'd won. She had never in her life been so wrong about anything. Silas set the deed down on the desk. "You all right, deputy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ray Callahan didn't answer. He couldn't. Because for a second he wasn't standing in that living room at all. He was 9 years old again, and he was under the ice. Let me tell you what Ray was seeing, because this is where the whole thing turns. 19 years ago, in the dead of an Iowa winter, a boy went out on the frozen river behind Birch Lane where the kids weren't supposed to go. The ice was thin near the middle where the current ran fast, and it broke, and the boy went straight down into black water so cold it stopped his heart mid-scream. His friends ran. They didn't know what to do. They were kids. They just ran, screaming for help, and the boy went under and the current started pulling him downstream beneath the ice, away from the hole, away from the light, away from any chance. There was one house close enough to hear, the old white farmhouse, and there was one man home. Silas Renner was 59 that winter, and he was already the kind of old that most men use as an excuse. He heard the screaming, and he didn't grab a coat, and he didn't call for help first, and he didn't stop to think about whether his heart could take it. He ran out onto that ice in his shirt sleeves, and when it cracked under him, he kept going, and he went into that black water after a boy he'd never met. He found the kid by his coat, got a fist in the fabric, and would not let go. The cold hit him like a wall, drove the air right out of his chest, and he told people later it was the only time in his life he was truly certain he was about to die. And how he dragged them both back up onto solid ice, nobody could ever quite explain, because a man that age in water that cold shouldn't have had the strength. But he did it. He pulled that boy out, blue and still, and he pounded on his chest and breathed into his mouth on the frozen bank until the boy coughed up river water and started to cry. That boy was Ray Callahan. Silas had wrapped him in his own dry coat and carried him to the road and waited with him until the ambulance came. And then, the way Silas did everything, he'd gone home quiet and never asked for a word of thanks. Ray's family tried. They came to the door with pies and cards and tears, and Silas just nodded and said any man would have done the same, which wasn't true, and everybody knew it wasn't true because the boy's own friends had run. Ray grew up on that story. His father told it at every birthday. There's a man across town who went under the ice for you, son. You remember that. You remember there are people in this world who run toward the water. Ray remembered. That story was the reason he'd pinned on a badge in the first place. He wanted to be the kind of man who ran toward the water. He just never once, in all these years, connected the name to a face. His family had moved away when he was 10. He'd only ever known the man as a legend, a name too big to belong to anyone you might actually meet. And now that legend was standing 3 feet in front of him, 78 years old, being called a squatter on his own porch. Ray Callahan came back to himself all at once, and when he did, his eyes were wet. Slowly, deliberately, the young deputy straightened his back. He set his clipboard down on the desk. He brought his boots together. And he raised his right hand in a crisp, trembling salute, held it there, and said, in a voice thick with something he could barely hold down, "It's good to see you, sir. It is real good to see you." Silas blinked. "Son, you don't need to be saluting me." "Yes, I do," Ray said. "Yes, I do, sir." He lowered his hand and wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist, not caring one bit that he was crying in uniform. "You don't remember me. There's no reason you would, but you saved my life, Mr. Renner. You pulled me out of the river. I was 9 years old. I'm the reason you got that." He nodded at the Medal of Honor and then at himself. "I'm the reason I wear this. You're the reason. It's been you my whole life, and I never even knew your face. And if you're still with me and this story is getting to you the way it got to me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next on that lawn is the part everybody needs to see. Because Diane was still out there, and she was done waiting. The front door was still open, and through it Diane could see the deputy just standing there, not arresting anybody, not dragging anybody out. She'd had enough. She marched back up the walk, up the porch steps, and stuck her head in the door. "What is going on in here? I called you an hour ago. Why is that man still in that chair? Arrest him. He's trespassing." "That house is not." Ray turned around, and the look on his face stopped her mid-word. "Ma'am," he said, and there was steel in it now, "step back outside, right now." "Excuse me, You work for us, I pay your. This man, Ray said, and his voice rose and shook, is Silas Renner. He owns this house. He has owned it for 49 years. And 19 years ago he went into a frozen river and pulled a drowning child out of the water and nearly died doing it. He took a breath. That child was me. The porch went dead quiet. Even Copper had gone still. Diane's mouth opened and closed. I didn't. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to know, Ray said. You were supposed to be decent. You called 911 on a Medal of Honor recipient because his paint was peeling. You called his dog a stray. You tried to have a war hero thrown out of his own home so your property value would go up. By now, doors were opening up and down Birch Lane. That's the thing about a commotion on a quiet street. People come out. Neighbors drifted onto their lawns, phones half raised, watching Diane Whitcomb stand frozen on that sagging porch with her white blazer and her red face. Ray wasn't done. He stepped out onto the porch so everyone could hear him, and he pointed back through the door at the wall. Everybody on this street walks past this house and sees an old man they wish would move. You want to know who he is? He carried 2 wounded men out of an ambush under fire when he was 21 years old. Took a bullet doing it and went back for the second man anyway. He's got a Medal of Honor in that living room. There are maybe a few dozen living men in this whole country who have one, and one of them has been sitting right here on your street this whole time, and not one of you ever bothered to knock and say hello. Somebody in the crowd said, "Oh my God." Somebody else just put a hand over their mouth. A man near the back took his hat off without seeming to notice he'd done it. Diane tried one more time, weak now. I was only trying to protect the neighborhood. You were trying to protect a number, Ray said. Go home, Mrs. Whitcomb. There's no crime here. There never was. The only person on this porch who did anything wrong today is you. And Diane Whitcomb, who had never in her life been at a loss for words, turned and walked down those steps with the whole street watching, and she didn't say another thing. Now here's the part that always gets me. Through all of it, Silas Renner had just sat there in his chair, one hand resting on Copper's gray head, watching this young man defend him. And when the crowd had gone quiet and Diane was gone, Silas finally spoke, and his voice was soft. Come here, son. Ray came back inside and knelt down beside the old man's chair, and Silas looked at him for a long moment, studying his face the way you study something you're trying to remember. The boy under the ice, Silas said slowly. You had a red coat. I've thought about you for 19 years, wondered if you made it, really made it, if you grew up all right. His hand shook as he reached out and rested it on Ray's shoulder. Look at you. You grew up just fine. And that was when the young deputy who'd walked in ready for a routine call put his head down on the old man's arm and cried like the 9-year-old boy he used to be, and the old soldier held on to him and let him. Copper laid his head across both of them and let out a long, low sigh, the way old dogs do when the trouble has finally passed. That was the day everything changed on Birch Lane, and it didn't change the way Diane wanted it to. Word got around fast. It always does. By that evening, half of Cedar Falls knew there was a Medal of Honor recipient living in the old white farmhouse. By the next morning, people Silas had never met were leaving flowers and folded notes on his porch steps. Kids drew him pictures. A woman left a pie, and this time there was somebody to eat it. The local paper called. Silas told them there wasn't much to say, which the reporter printed anyway, because a man like that saying there wasn't much to say was the whole story right there. And the neighbors, the same neighbors who'd spent years wishing that house would just disappear, they were ashamed. Not the loud, dramatic kind of ashamed. The quiet kind. The kind that makes a person want to actually do something. It was old Mr. Petrusek, 3 doors down, who started it. He showed up on Silas's porch that Saturday with a ladder and 2 cans of white paint and said, "Mr. Renner, I'd be honored if you'd let me fix up this porch with you." And Silas, who'd never in his life asked a soul for help, was too tired and too moved to say no. By noon there were a dozen people there. By afternoon there were 30. Somebody's teenage son fixed the loose board Silas had been meaning to get to for 40 years. A retired carpenter rehung the sagging porch so it stood level for the first time in a decade. Somebody trimmed the tree limb the HOA had written him up for. The whole street painted that old farmhouse white and clean and bright, and they didn't do it to raise a property value. They did it because they were sorry, and because sorry doesn't mean much until you pick up a paintbrush. Ray Callahan was there every one of his days off. He and Silas got to be real friends, the kind that don't need a lot of words. Ray would come by after his shift and sit on that porch, and the two of them would watch the street go by, the young man who ran toward the water and the old man who taught the whole town what that meant. Diane Whitcomb put her house up for sale within the month. She told people it was for work. Nobody believed her. The truth was she couldn't stand on her own lawn anymore without feeling the weight of what she'd tried to do. She'd looked at an old man and his dog and seen a problem to be removed, and the whole street had watched her learn exactly what she'd been looking at. Some lessons you can't live next to. Before she left, something happened that nobody expected. She walked across the grass one gray evening to that freshly painted porch, and she stood at the bottom of the steps with her hands folded in front of her like a girl called to the principal's office. "Mr. Renner," she said, and her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was small. "I owe you an apology. There aren't words big enough for what I tried to do. I'm not going to make excuses. I was wrong in every way a person can be wrong, and I'm sorry." Silas looked at her a long moment. Copper lifted his head off the old man's boots and studied her too. And here's the thing about Silas Renner. A smaller man would have sent her away, would have made her stand there and feel it. But Silas hadn't gone into that river all those years ago because he thought people deserved saving. He'd gone in because that's just what you do. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, and he nodded at the empty chair beside him. "You look tired. Coffee's still hot." She started to cry right there on the steps, and she sat down, and the two of them watched the sun go down over Birch Lane, not as friends exactly, but as two people who both understood, finally, what mattered and what didn't. Silas Renner passed away a little under 2 years later, in his sleep in that same house, with Copper on the floor beside his bed. He went quiet the way he'd lived. They gave him a funeral with full honors, and you should have seen who came. The whole street, half the town, and a line of men in uniform that stretched clear around the block, because when a Medal of Honor recipient dies, his brothers come, no matter how far they have to drive. Ray Callahan carried one corner of the casket. And when they folded the flag that had hung on that living room wall and pressed it into his hands, because Silas had left it to him, Ray Callahan held it against his chest and stood at attention and did not let a single tear fall until it was over, the way the old man would have wanted. Copper wouldn't leave the porch after that. He'd lie by the empty chair and wait. So Ray took him home, and the old shepherd lived out his last year on a young deputy's porch, watching a new street go by, one step from the man who loved the man who saved him. And every so often when Ray tells this story, somebody asks him why. Why an old man with a shaking heart went into that black water. Why he built a porch he never asked anyone to sit on. Why he never once mentioned the medal on his wall. And Ray always says the same thing. Some men spend their whole lives trying to look important. And some men just quietly go toward the water, again and again, and never say a word about it, and you don't find out who they were until somebody tries to throw them away. That's who Silas Renner was. And the woman who called the cops to get him out, she learned it the same way the whole street did. Too late to take it back, but not too late to be changed. Now you go be the kind of person who knocks on the old man's door before it's too late. Believe me, it matters more than you know.